actually is the way that breakthroughs happen. It's not a giant leaping of the line. It's, I'm going to take this risk, see how it works. I can take a bigger risk. The really horrible reality to that, comes up in terms of, I'm not trying to bring the room down, but it's actually important for you to know as leaders, because expecting people to make giant leaps in their behavior is not realistic. People who commit suicide, guess what they do? They go shopping for a gun, they don't buy a gun. They go shopping again, they look at it, they hold one. They go shopping again, they buy one. It's this incrementalism, and so what we're doing is pushing that line in terms of trust. You guys wanted to shift?
So we have talked about you in terms of your leadership arc because it's fascinating, where you started in the private sector and moving into nonprofits. And so, as you've heard, we've done a lot of research. And one of the things that we read about was the Give Big campaign, and the challenge that the Seattle Foundation and you yourself as the leader faced. And so as we make this transition, Kate's going to start asking us around the nonprofit themes that we've talked about. But I think it would be great if you could talk to us about that leadership challenge, how it affected you and your, the journey that you're on to understand how best to impact an organizational change, a leadership change, and to support the people here as you've become this new leader, and you're from this very interesting and challenging Microsoft background that some might say that tech leadership should be sort of a natural thing for you, but you had this huge tech challenge. So if you could talk to us a little bit about that'd be great.
That's a great question. The line of crisis doesn't build character, it exposes it. So, here we are. It was my second Give Big, ex-tech guy, platform crashes. I mean, it was it was one of those battle stations scenes, and a couple things emerged for me. One thing that I felt incredibly proud of in my team was that they worked incredibly well with each other in crisis. As a leader, because I'd been in crisis before, I oriented towards calm and openness, urgency, but calm and openness, not losing your center. Part of my self-study on psychology is about the vagal nervous system. If you haven't read about it, I encourage you to go read about it online. Vagal nervous system wraps around the brain, down the spine, wraps around the heart, wraps around the belly. It determines the orientation of any human animal at any time, and basically all human animals are in one of three states. They're either conscious, we're all pretty much conscious. Nobody in this room seems hugely activated. Conscious and centered, fight or flight, or freeze. Freeze is when an animal, including a human animal, just goes into complete shock. When leaders allow themselves to leave conscious and centered and drop into fight or flight, that's when you start to see some of the worst leadership qualities. That's when you see temper. That's when you see accusation and blame. That's when you see erraticism, irrationality. Interestingly, one of the things, if you study the vagal nervous system and how human animals drop into fight or flight, when it happens, the human animal, based upon millennium upon millennium of evolution, start to pump different chemicals into the rest of your system that allow you to actually fight or flee. And it also drives blood to the vital organs to prepare you for injury, which causes blood to leave the brain. That's why people who go into fight or flight do and say unwise things. So my consciousness of my own state at that moment, because this was a big deal for us. I mean, this is a major thing that we do for the community. And yes, I didn't actually feel at the time personal vulnerability about the accusation of having the next tech guy have a platform crash on him. It did occur to me afterwards, but that I was really thinking about, what does the team do? What's the right move right now? What do we say? What decision do we make? And if I did anything well that day, it was that I created an atmosphere for my team that was not activating their fight or flight, to allow them to stay centered and conscious and make good decisions together on behalf of our community and behalf of our organization. And they did. They did. We could have ended the thing, not gone to a second day, which other communities did when this crash happened nationally. We could have shut down, gone into freeze, and not communicated with nonprofits. We apologized very sincerely, very directly, very quickly, and so on. There were some mistakes we made as well, but we actually kind of recognized those as they happened and then acknowledged those. The last thing I'll say is that my reminding the team that our number one orientation was what is in the best interests of the community, not in how do we cover Seattle Foundation's ass, not in how do we assign blame to others, or any number of other orientations. Atmosphere and direction were the two things that I was conscious of and tried to exhibit at that time.
Thank you for that.
So we want to talk a little bit about nonprofit themes now. Hoping you can give us a broad overview of the current state of the nonprofit community in Seattle and some of the current upcoming leadership challenges that we face.
All right. If you step back and look at the world is kind of 300 super regions. Regions defined as usually a hub city or twin cities and then a string of secondary cities. If you think about the world in terms of human mobility, any kind of economics, demographics, etc., it's really more useful to think of the world in terms of these 300 odd regions than it is in terms of countries or provinces or districts or states or counties, because the rest of those geographical boundaries, independent of certain wars that are happening, are less, they're actually less important. Population globally is surging on those 300 regions. The United States has about 25 of them, where 80% of the US population going to 85% of the US population is surging on those regions. We are one of those regions. We are one that has more aggregate assets than any other in the country, save Northern California, which is hard to define because it's kind of it's a super region. It's a mashup of a lot of stuff. But against the backdrop of how society works, just so you know, because of climate change, based upon the studies, our weather's going to keep getting better over the next half a century. So we should feel great about that. But the rest of the country is going to be plagued by drought, flooding, and a whole bunch of other horrible things. So population is going to continue to surge on the Northwest. And the system of society, and what does the public sector do? What does the social sector do? And what does the private sector do? And that playbook doesn't work. It doesn't work. We have the most incredible assets of good corporate citizens, socially conscious population, amazing wealth creation for some, leadership in gay rights, in gun control, in wage equality, the list goes on. But our disparities and our inequities, especially for communities of color, are amongst the worst in the country. We have the largest achievement gap between white kids and African American kids, education achievement gap, we are the 5th worst of the 200 largest school districts in the country. We have homelessness state of emergency. We have, for Washington State, led by the population of our region, is 48th in the country in terms of college enrollment, 42nd in the country in terms of high school achievement. So that's, when I say it doesn't work, like we are what our numbers say we are. How do you have all of those assets and all of those disparities? And our calculation, and those partners that we work with, is that system of, that playbook needs to be rewritten. What is the role, and I'm getting to your question, but I need to give you the landscape to answer it effectively. Once upon a time, charity was participated in by those who've done well in society, and they saw that there were cracks where people had fallen through, and they wanted to try to, either out of altruism, fairness, or ego, help those who've fallen through those cracks. Those cracks have become systemic crevasses. And those systemic crevasses are not, the private sector is not addressing those. Government, depending upon whether you have good electeds and competent bureaucracies, can sometimes do some good, but is proven to be inadequate in that respect. So then we, in what I'll call the social sector, think both funders and funded, foundations, philanthropy, and nonprofits, have to ask ourselves, what is our role? There's a extremely high net worth and very invested philanthropist, not the richest man in the world, but in the top 20 here in this community. He and his partner have said every dollar they spend, they want to spend to stimulate the public sector to do the things the public sector should do to improve people's lives. Because the realization is that nonprofits, philanthropy cannot gap fill these systemic problems. They can catalyze change and initiatives that might make a difference. They can expose coherent problem statements and potential solution strategies. They can attempt to partner with government and private sector in new ways around how they can do a better job. So it's all quite fluid and dynamic right now, against the backdrop of those trend lines worsening. The middle class in our region has been decimated. And we had an incredible guy come and speak to some philanthropists. I hosted a dinner with him last week. His name is Dr. Manuel Pastor from USC. He's probably one of the leading thinkers on equity in the country. And he's a college professor. And he said, look, when I make more now meaningfully than college professors when I was born. But my dad was a janitor. And if I were a janitor today, I'd make a lot less than he made when I was born. So our scissor charts are going the wrong direction on that stuff. Nonprofit, what we're working on now is what is our role with our nonprofit partners against that backdrop? Because the way we're doing things, you go to Wellspring Family Services on Rainier Avenue, and they will tell you that they and their partners are doing a great job fighting homelessness. They work with youth homelessness, but the funnel keeps getting bigger. So how do we go upstream, not at intervention, but at prevention and reinvention from a systems perspective, and address income inequality, address economic inclusion, address equity strategies around education achievement that can begin changing, shifting that.
Most small nonprofits can't do that.
No, well, in reality, no one can do that on their own. You know, we can't, and this is where the private sector, I'll say to you, some of you in the room are, developing private sector leaders. This whole private sector attitude of, we're going to, look, some of the companies in the community do a lot in terms of corporate citizenship, not save what their employees do. But guess what? There's this thing called the Gini coefficient, started by a guy who's a professor named Gini, Italian professor. And Gini coefficient said, so the lower Gini coefficient, the more equal a community you have. So 0 Gini coefficient is, in fact, the world of Star Trek. Everyone is exactly the same wealth. And the higher the Gini coefficient, the greater the spread, the wealth distribution. There's a new study that shows that there is a direct correlation between a low Gini coefficient and an economically vibrant, globally competitive region. That makes people sort of step back and think that shouldn't necessarily be true. You could have a bifurcation of society where, like ours, there is a smaller percentage of people who are doing extremely well, and as long as the companies are successful and they're accomplishing their mission, they're delivering shareholder value and profitability and share, and their employees are in a good place, well, what does the rest really, how does the rest really matter? Guess what? It actually does. One of the lower Gini coefficients in the world is Singapore. Now, it's a city-state, so it can do things that are harder to do in a republic like ours. But Singapore got this math and does things to develop its region and its people in a far more equitable way, has actually a growing and thriving middle class, and is, in fact, economically far more competitive. So we have to like get that flywheel spinning in terms of the minds of a CFO of one of your employers looking at investing in economic inclusion, workforce training, workforce development, not as just a loss line on their P&L, but actually as something that directly correlates to the future viability of their capitalist organization.
Some more questions about what businesses can do.
Am I sounding like the Unabomber?
No. Some more questions about nonprofit and business engagement, but going back to the structure of the nonprofit community, if you could wave a magic wand and make 3 structural changes to nonprofit organizations, specifically in Seattle, what would you do?
To organizations on an individual by individual basis, or to the entire field?
To the field, yeah.
That's an interesting, why? I want to ask you about why you asked that question, but I'll just try to answer the question. Because I can't. But okay. I would.
He can, but he doesn't feel good about it.
Before you answer,
yeah.
let's expose a little vulnerability here. Tell him why you asked the question, because that might help with the answer.
Oh, because I think most nonprofits shouldn't exist. Most nonprofit leaders shouldn't exist, and there are way too many nonprofits that are totally
I suspected something like that. More extreme and direct than I expected, though. That is a problem, which I'll get to in a second, but it's not actually the first problem. For those who live in the private sector, congratulations, you actually live in a fairly simple world. You live in a world of profitability, valuation, competitiveness. You know, the levers you have in the private sector, well, you may have very complex problems. You know, winning the living room is a complex problem. It's a complex technology problem, it's a complex everything problem. But the levers you use of build, buy, partner, in order to compete, to win, are driven by market forces. It is pretty unambiguous what the financial markets, how they judge a Home Street Bank or how they judge a Nintendo. No one really knows how to judge a law firm because you guys live in a sort of secret society of profit sharing that you don't tell anybody about. But the point is, in the rest of the world, there are no market forces. One would think that if you were running a region, you actually would want a common set of indicators, dare I say a scorecard, on what we are all trying to achieve in terms of our success. But it doesn't exist. There's 300 different ways that people in this community are trying to frame what success looks like. And I would change that, and we're going to try. We actually, no region in the country right now is governed by an aligned set of health indicators that the private sector, the public sector, and the social sector all run any of your organizations without an aligned set of goals. I would, do you guys know what Heckman's curve is? So
Sounds like a song from the 50s.
I have a pet peeve about whiteboard markers here that don't work. So this is ROI on a social investment, and this is life from birth to death. Heckman is a professor at the University of Chicago who studies what is the most important, social investment strategy. And it just turns out that the earlier you make an investment in a person's life, the greater return on society. 92% of the child's brain is developed by the time they are 4. And if you don't create the right atmosphere for children in almost every way, you pay for it as society. I don't mean to sound too clinical, but I'm being economic right now. And so what happens is that ROI declines meaningfully. We have an initiative called Skill Up that, amongst other things, helps former prisoners re-enter society and establish economic opportunity for themselves, etc. It's an amazing program in terms of the human impact. Its ROI is a mess compared with what we might do on initiatives up here. Your tax dollars are distributed the exact inverse of Heckman's curve. So right now, your King County or Washington State tax dollars, 75% of it is jails, cops, courts, it's criminal justice. What I would do, if I had my wish list, is start to the appropriate process of moving public investment, your tax dollars, towards things that can impact people's lives. There's a professor named Robert Putnam who's written a number of books, including Bowling Alone, Our Kids. He and his Harvard statisticians have done a study that correlates what are the life experiences of a child with any modest semblance of the American dream. And have you read Our Kids? Okay. Turns out that by their study, these are things like family dinners and modestly good education and being able to play organized athletics and study a musical instrument and have some exposure to arts and the outdoors. Really things that many people who have any sort of economic stability would consider a normal thing. I have a kid who in 2 hours is going to be practicing football on the Interbay fields and plays on Saturday. He's 13. I pay $600 a year for that. Transportation, pay to play athletics. Well, if I'm a single mom in South King County with a 13-year-old kid and I'm working 2 jobs, my kid's not going to play football. That is an X in that data model for that child in terms of that semblance to the American dream. By their study, only about 1/3 of the kids in this country right now have any chance of the American dream because of that problem. And then the third thing is your passion. It's just a dog's breakfast of overlaps and gaps and duplications and just. You have to be careful with that one because part of the good thing about it is that some of the most amazing human change has come from, and I spent the morning with a bunch of small grassroots nonprofits. If I just took this draconian view of we are the community's nonprofit M&A organization, I could say, you must die, you must fold into them, and yet it might actually be a negative thing in terms of innovations and the impact on some local communities.
Yeah.
That would come as a result of it. So if you feel like you want to lead that for us.
Considering some of the bigger challenges like equity in particular and making more diverse leadership organizations and making sure organizations reflect equity challenges, inclusiveness, but also just trying to keep the lights on. It's really hard for all these nonprofit organizations that have some of the same goals to have really smart measurements, focus on things that really turn a good ROI, and also reach those larger goals. So that's where the question really comes from. It's really hard to reach some of those broader goals with just doing the day-to-day work, keeping the lights on.
You know, we have a stated value. Since I joined here, we have instituted a stated value on equity and opportunity, and we have a program team led by people who have their entire lives dedicated to equity principles. And one of our innovations is an effort with King County around what we call communities of opportunity. The very strategy of communities of opportunity actually turns that model of ensuring your